This is a CoverageBook hosted webinar, and this is the second. We've actually started a new series. So you may have joined last month's one, and that was with me and Hannah. Hannah has gone on maternity leave. She's just had a baby girl, so which is all lovely. And so I'm hosting this one this month, but it is a new series, and each month we will be focusing in on, you've guessed it, things to do with PR coverage. But we will be joined by an expert every month, because although this is hosted by CoverageBook, this isn't a walkthrough of the tool. We will mention it here and there where relevant, but it's definitely not a sales pitch, and it's definitely not a walkthrough of the tool. If you do need any kind of walkthroughs of the tool, just give David a shout in your live chat on within the app, or just email support@coveragebook.com. And we've also got recorded videos as well, which I'm sure you know about. But if you want a full tutorial, do check out the CoverageBook YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/CoverageBook, and you can find all of the tutorials on CoverageBook, but also the last webinar as well. So if you missed that one, I recommend checking it out, because it's about estimated views and why reach might not be the best KPI for you for this year. Anyway, today we're talking about social coverage, which is a really important one, because I think many of you will be in CoverageBook 2 now, hopefully, and even if you're not a CoverageBook user, I'm sure you're getting social coverage. It is the majority of a lot of people's campaigns now, and how we collate and measure is constantly changing. So we all just need to share with each other the best ways of doing that. And so I am joined by this month's expert, Steph Bridgeman. I've worked with Steph over a number of years now, and I will get Steph to do a better intro, but I can say that having focused in on PR measurement for definitely the last 10 years, actually, I've been really into PR measurement, and I've known Steph probably for most of those years, and she is an absolute superstar in measuring the outputs and outcomes of public relations, and all types of public relations as well. So you're gonna see some of that, and she's gonna share some of her amazing tips. So actually, Steph, so sorry if I've taken over your intro, but do you want to share some more about what you do and who you work with?
Yeah, cheers, Stella. Thank you. Thanks for having me on today. And it's lovely to be back with CoverageBook, sharing my insights. I'm called Steph Bridgeman. I run my own consultancy called Experienced Media Analysts. That consultancy provides freelance media analysts to the measurement industry, the media intelligence industry, to PR agencies, because many of them have either got their own analytics divisions or are seeking some external help to support them and upskilling them in that area. And we also work with in-house departments as well. So I've been in this profession for about 22 years and seen the evaluation sector evolve an awful lot. And of course, in that 22 years, we've seen both the rise of online media, but also the rise of social media. So we're going to focus today talking about social media to a certain extent. I also wanted to mention Stella and I are both involved, and I've just literally come off from a board meeting, AMEC, which is the International Association for the Measurement and Evaluation of Communication. And I just wanted to give them a shout out for alongside CoverageBook being two of the great beacons in our industry, for putting out some great educational content there. I love the content that you put out, Stella, and everybody at CoverageBook, but also wanted to encourage people to check out the AMEC website too for any additional resources that you may be looking for in relation to communications measurement.
Yeah, if you're not using the AMEC frameworks already, I really do recommend that you do. As Steph said, they're international. So no matter what kind of organization you are, what country you're in, you will find some really amazing free help there. Yeah, there are lots of different options with those guys, but amazing frameworks for all sorts of types of evaluation as well. So obviously with CoverageBook, it's the reporting of coverage. AMEC just covers everything. So if you really want to dive into that ROI. But without further ado, what we're doing today, so a couple of housekeeping things. You're already in the chat saying hi to us. That's great. I'd love you to post questions either in the chat or through the question function as and when you feel to ask, and we will save some time at the end to answer as many as possible. I'll be keeping an eye on the time so we can answer them. And As always, this is being recorded and you will get a link to the recording. I know that people ask because this is a different time. So yes, you will get an email tomorrow, latest Monday, with the recording. And if you miss the email, it'll always be on our YouTube channel. Okay, so let's dive in with the first question. So Steph, where are we? Because as I mentioned, brand social, so social for public relations and comms, where are we with measurement? It's quite a broad question, but it does change all of the time, doesn't it?
Yeah, and then you've got up here on the deck here that we have seen some research out there that does demonstrate that engagement rates are declining. And we wanted to start by, we can send a link out to that research up with the notes, but we wanted to start by explaining to people what engagement actually means in the context of social media. So I've put together a little table, I think. Is that on the next slide? Yeah, there we go. Brilliant. So what does engagement really mean? I've put here is just some of the key social channels and some of the key metrics that are considered to be engagement metrics within those channels. And if you're working, if you have one of those channels, i.e. if you own one of those channels, if you have a page on one of those channels, you get access to a great richness of data if you export your post level performance. And sometimes this information is visible to an external audience too. So engagement can be a metric which is very useful to look at from the point of view of not just your performance, but perhaps of those competitors around you as well. But I've just jotted down here some of the key elements which contribute towards the combination of things that equal engagement per social channel. And so they can be things like likes and replies and comments. Of course, on YouTube, we've got likes and we've got dislikes, but actually dislikes are now hidden from view. I do believe that dislikes may be a metric that are still visible to the channel owner on YouTube, but invisible to the outside world. But they're also evidence of these kind of outcome sort of metrics indicating actions that people have taken as a result of being exposed to coverage. So it could be things like people clicking on a link, clicking directly onto your profile, clicking through and watching a video, and so on. So we just wanted to just remind people what engagement means. It doesn't necessarily just mean likes, comments and shares, for example. It's all of those other touch points that can be tagged digitally, and they are combined together to equal engagement.
As Steph said, we will send a link out to the research from Rival HQ. It's the latest, and it, as I say, is showing that engagements are going down. However, no big surprise. We've paid behind some of the posts. They are seeing better rates. Not a big surprise, but that seems to be the more brands just need to be doing now, which I'm sure many of you have got involved with even your campaigns as well. But we'll send a link out to that research because it's where we are right now.
And you've been talking about the word rate, and I've been talking about the word engagement. So engagement rates, what does that mean? And I think engagement rates can be really useful because if you think back on that previous slide, you may be present on multiple different social media channels, but each of those channels might have a different audience size, or you might do a different level of activity on each different channel, depending on the type of audience you're trying to reach and the type of activities you're carrying out. And so I find engagement rates to be a really useful way to be able to effectively compare apples with apples rather than apples with pears in terms of social media performance, because it allows you to consider the way in which audiences are interacting with the content, i.e. the engagement, but also you're able to factor that into the potential reach of that content, the post-level reach. And so if you divide one thing by the other, you get an engagement rate. It's often expressed as a percentage, and don't be surprised if these percentages are actually quite small. Sometimes an engagement rate between about 3 and 5% is considered to be standard for an organisation. So it's one of those percentages. 5% could be considered a really good result. And I think it's important to understand that context around the relatively low levels of engagement rates that people do see on social. Often it can be boosted, of course, by paid promotion. I suppose that's probably one of the strategies of the social channels themselves, is to encourage us to spend our hard-earned marketing dollars with them in order to improve engagement rates.
There it is, just there as well.
Yeah. Okay, let's do a bit of maths. So I was just explaining that just now. What does it mean? So it combines all of those factors that we saw on the table a few slides ago, all of those things that are linked to action. So your likes, your comments, your shares, your link clicks, and so on. And how well each post has performed. So if you're talking about your own social posts, you've got access to the actual post level performance of that particular post. If you know how that's performed, you're able to effectively divide one number by the other, and that's the percentage that you end up with. So we just wanted to give you a simple math lesson, which is literally engagements divided by reach equals engagement rate.
Yeah. Okay, so so that's where we are, and just to get the terminology so we're all on the same page with that. But going right to the beginning of our processes, this might seem like a simple one. How do we capture social coverage? Used to be a lot easier before Reels, stories, TikToks. But yeah, there's a few different things here, and I wanted to cover it. I said to Steph this morning, I feel like we need to cover this actually, especially talking to various people who use CoverageBook. And obviously you need to put your coverage into CoverageBook and seeing those different ways of how we monitor and capture. I just wanted to speak to Steph about this because Steph, you have a team of people who are going through, sometimes, depending on what kind of campaign it is, but sometimes thousands and thousands of posts and pieces of coverage. So that's been captured and gone through at some stage. I think a question before we dive into the sides, like, what stage does it come to you and your team when you're analysing sort of big campaigns?
So we get data in a range of different formats. I'm about to reveal what it says on the next slide, but ultimately we often get just a list of links, and then we have to go and open those links and we analyze the content from it. It depends whose platform we're working on, because we work with a number of different media evaluation agencies, and some of them are able to ingest those links and then actually ingest the content of those links, whether that be a social link or actually a piece of news coverage. And I just wanted to highlight that if you are using any kind of either social listening tool or news monitoring tool, most of those tools will have the ability for you to export those results to an Excel spreadsheet. That's my favorite function of any SaaS tool, actually, is the export to Excel button, because I like to take it all offline and you do with it what you will.
Can I jump in there just in case people don't know? I'll be surprised if they don't, but I have to mention it. If you're not aware and you are a CoverageBook user, if you go to the share area, you can download to CSV. So with all of the new metrics, now you can add social coverage into CoverageBook. You'll get all of those metrics in, and yeah, CSV, down as CSV is your friend, right, Steph?
Yeah, I'm a very strange CoverageBook user, because most people will use CoverageBook for the amazing, beautiful PDF functionality. And I think that's probably one of the kind of core reasons for people signing up. But I actually don't use it for that functionality whatsoever. I shove all my URLs in, press the button, you do all of your magic. But I ignore the PDF bit and I just go straight to the export to Excel, because what I find CoverageBook allows me to do is it allows me to take a bunch of URLs, which is literally just a list. And by putting it in CoverageBook, you're doing this heavy lifting for me, because you're turning it into what's called structured data. So you're placing it into columns, you're finding the date for me, you're auto filling in the headline and things, the source. And so you're doing a lot of the processing work that I would have had to pay my media analysts to do back in the day before all of this. Effectively, it's called metadata. It comes to us. So yeah, to a certain extent, most of our coverage comes to us with this metadata pre-filled in, the date, the source, the content, and so on. And our job as media analysts is to go in and enrich some of that to assess how sentiment and message delivery and so on. But I would just encourage anybody that's reporting or collecting data in order to do some reporting in the future is don't waste your time doing the screenshot for yourself. That's why we've got tools like CoverageBook. And don't waste your time saving the screenshots for people like me, the media analyst, because actually often the quality of the screenshots are so awful that we have to go and Google the piece of content and find it and Google it at source as well. So URLs can just be a really simple way to collect information, and with tools such as CoverageBook, you can do so much with that afterwards.
So on the actual sort of monitoring and collating, there's so many tools out there. From my experience, they the right ones depend on what you're doing. Do you have any favorites when some of the coverage and you need to do the analysis? Or is it more about what the guys who are on this webinar do with it? I know that with a lot of mentions, if you're working for a big brand, there's so many mentions, like a Coca-Cola or whatever. So many mentions, isn't there? Do you ever get delivered all of that? Like, or
often with those big kind of brands with huge volumes of let's say social mentions, for example. I remember working for one brand, and we used to do a weekly report for them, and one week President Trump decided to at them, so they went from having sort of 5,000 tweets a week to 500,000 tweets that week, and it was one of those kind of like, my goodness, how do we deal with this? Whatever it was, 100-fold, 1,000-fold increase in volume of coverage without ruining the budget for this client and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes with those kinds of organizations, it's about actually sampling that data in a sensible way, being able to focus, perhaps either have a random sample or be able to focus on those that consistently tweet or consistently engage, i.e. have produced perhaps several posts about a topic, or perhaps focus on those with certain audience sizes and so on and so forth. So you often have to be smart when you're dealing with those social data, because there is so much social data out there that you often start with a huge volume, and you have to actually only analyze a fraction of that content. But you can still make some really meaningful insights from that.
Yeah, so there's a bit of, some people have to do a bit of sifting, depending on what kind of campaign and client they're working on. But if you do have once you have your list of URLs now for social, and this might be obvious to some, but I know for some people it's not, you can, yes, the presentation will be available afterwards, just to answer that quick question because I just saw it. But I know that some of our users were going, trying to record sort of Instagram and TikTok on their phones. You can access them through a browser, through main posts. So just grab the URLs, and now you can put them straight into CoverageBook, and then we can pull in all of the data, whether you just want the report from CoverageBook or you go onto the Steph's saying to download CSV. All of the metrics are in there, engagements, everything. So obviously I did just mention Instagram, and yes, for main posts and for TikTok now as well, you can add those URLs straight into CoverageBook, and we do have them. But yes, Rita, you're right. Stories, you can't. We will constantly, it'll always be our challenge to try and get around. When we were building CoverageBook 2, the developers probably won't want me to say this, but one week, I did see that we managed to pull in one Instagram story, but it just didn't hold up because of the way Instagram has been built, and they don't want us to be able to do that. But we'll always keep trying. But in the meantime, I just thought I could just drop this tip in. There is a site called storysaver.net. I'm not sure if you guys are using it. If you're not, please do. And you can record Instagram stories here through this tool, which helps you upload them quicker to CoverageBook. But everything else social you can use and put it in. And I do recommend, and again, people use CoverageBook in different ways, but recommend just putting in all of your coverage, because there is a new area called the Coverage Vault, which is constantly pulling in metrics. And what that does is at the end of your quarter or the end of the year, whenever you're doing your sort of bigger evaluation, all of the metrics for all of your coverage will be there. So start just thinking of it as your coverage vault, really, just putting in all of those pieces, and you'll get an up-to-date metrics all of the time. And I'll come on to metrics later. So let's move on. So let's actually think about the coverage itself. So we've moved on from collating it, post versus page. And so let's get into the nitty-gritty. How should it actually be measured, Steph?
Yeah, I just want to reflect on that as well, because it makes me think of a piece of work we were doing last week for a client, and somebody tried to use the number of followers of a certain page as the potential reach of that piece of coverage. And I want to explain why I don't think that's the right way to do it. And if you just think about how we as humans interact on social, we might go to a brand or somebody's page at the beginning and we press, but actually that's then the only time we really go to that page, because then, having liked that page, the posts that are uploaded to that page are the things that appear in your newsfeed. So I feel that humans interact more with posts than they do with the page, and that's why you might have heard me earlier talk about post level impressions as opposed to page level impressions. So I wanted to just describe the difference between the two, really. And I've got some examples basically from my own social media profiles, not able to share important data from those of my clients because I've shared NDAs. So I'm sharing with you my data. So this is my Twitter profile, and I've got 825 followers. And so it might be tempting if, let's say, if I mention your brand and then you wanted to include me in your analysis because it would have been a piece of earned social media, you might look at my following and think, oh, potentially that could have reached 825 people. But actually, we know that some of those people probably bots that are following me. Sometimes
I follow you, Steph, but I don't sit and watch your profile waiting for
exactly.
you. As much as I love you, I don't tender hooks waiting for your next tweet.
And this is the point, isn't it? Like, we go through fits and starts, and 1 minute we do spend an awful lot of time on social media, the next minute we don't. So we all know that a follower figure for an account is really not a very useful metric to indicate actually the impact of a particular post. And I've got just put up my post. It's actually the Valentine's balloon that I gave to my hubby last week. He really likes the dog poo emoji, and I love that. I just love that balloon, so I had to buy that for him for Valentine's Day. But of course, once you own your own Twitter account or your brand Twitter account, you do have that little button per post with the sort of three little bars, which basically allows you to see on a post by post basis how many people that reached. And this particular, you're probably all going to be going and looking for this now, clicking on it, and my reach will go up. But actually only 140, it had 114 impressions, which is a small fraction of my potential 825 followers. Obviously not many people interacted with it. If some other people had interacted with it, perhaps if Kanye West had interacted with it, maybe my impressions would have gone up, or so on. But it just goes to show that you should be cautious perhaps of using the follower of a page to give results to your post. And I just wanted to underline that point again here with my LinkedIn post. I think I've got just over 1,100 followers on LinkedIn. So again, you might be tempted to say that every post that I put out on LinkedIn is likely to reach 1,000 people, but it's not the case. And actually, my most viral post ever reached over 13,000 people. And it just goes to show that doing some of these personal posts on LinkedIn can work really well, because this was a picture of me, and it was one of those long kind of personal posts about me and my childhood. But lots of people interacted with it. It obviously then went way beyond my following, because I've only got 1,146 connections, and so to achieve a reach or a number of views of 13,000, for me, I consider that to be viral because it's way beyond my following. And so that was my best post. But actually my worst post is when I had a go at doing one of those LinkedIn articles. You know how you can have a post and an article? I thought, I'm going to try and do an article, and it only reached 30 people. If you'd gone for the 146 as the potential audience of all of my posts, that would have been wrong, because it could have been much higher, it could have been much lower. And it just goes to show that it's actually very important, if you can and you have got access to the post level information, to export that, because posts can perform in a completely different way. Of course, you have to be the data owner. You have to be linked to that account in order to get access to that data. But there are some metrics, those engagement metrics that we were looking at on the previous few slides, where the engagement data at least is publicly available. You can see how many people have liked, you can see how many people have shared, and so on, and you can see how many people have, for example, watched a video. So there are some data elements which are bespoke or private to you as the account owner, and there are others that everybody can see.
Yeah, so I'm sure you guys are doing this, but you have any sort of paid agreements with influencers or anything like that, obviously you can get access to their metrics there. So what do we do if we don't, and it is actually just naturally earned? Well, as if you're working in CoverageBook 2, we have a new metric, which we are looking at estimated views for social now. You would be used to the estimated views for any of your media relations, so any kind of articles, online publication coverage, and the way that we have worked that out in the past, which that's been a metric that's been in the tool for, I think we've been going for 7 years now, and we've constantly improved it, but we have had some really good feedback on the accuracy. Even though it is an estimation, it has been really accurate when it's been tested by people who do have access to analytics. And this is the normal estimated views metric, which you'll be used to. We now have an estimated view number for CoverageBook 2. I need to stop reading these great comments coming into the chat because it's distracting me. But thank you, Catherine. That's good to know. But yeah, we've got estimated views for social because, as Steph just said, it's really important that we can't just get more accurate on our media relations. It has to be across the board. And as we know, like social can be so skewed if we're just looking at followers. And A, it doesn't really tell us anything for our planning. B, it definitely doesn't tell our clients anything. And C, it probably won't deliver anything if we're just constantly talking about followers. I'm working with Gary on how we can release a bit more information about the formula, but very briefly what we will do is we do look at followers, but we look at reach rate. So the reach rate, it means it's based on some research, again, from Rival HQ, who have done some amazing research in social, and it's based on around like the higher the followers, actually the lower the reach is. And so we have come up with an average around that, and then the big one would be engagement. So when you add a social piece of coverage URL into CoverageBook, most of you will know, if you have had a play around with it, the screen grab isn't a screen grab, it's actually embedded. We did have a question actually around that. So Harry asked if the metrics were updated. Yes, because it's embedded, so the engagements will always be up to date. The estimated views is actually an estimate of its lifetime. That's where we take into consideration the reach rate, and then as the engagements come through, we can then take that calculation based on the followers, the reach rate, and then how many people we think would be seeing that. Yeah, if you do have any owned pieces that you do have access to the true impression data and reach data, then test away and let us know what you think of this new metric. But for any that we do think it's a really good estimation. If you want more detail on how we work that out, let me know, because it's quite, I didn't come up with the formula. You probably could have guessed that, but it's very detailed. I've got pages and pages of how the formula was worked out, and I've been going through, but that is the top line view. If you need to share that with your clients, that's how it's worked out.
Harry's question and your answer there is really good, though, about does the data update, because it links to a point about when to report, so to speak.
Yeah.
You might be working on a report for February and you might have a deadline to do that report and report up to board on the 1st or 2nd of March, and that's all very well, but any posts that you've put out on the 28th of February have only had 1 or 2 days in order to travel and amass reach, whereas those posts from the beginning of February have had 28 days to do so. It's just that's a really amazing function that you've got. It's taking into account the longer tail and the fact that reach grows over time.
Yeah, another reason as to using that vault as well, it's almost like a background benefit, really. It's constantly updating. But at the end of the year, you might have had a post that was reshared, or somebody engaged with it later on, and when someone was browsing somebody's profile, you never know. But those engagements will be updated, and so your end of year reports will have the latest. But just to mention again, estimated views metric, our formula here, that is based on its lifetime. So that one won't go up and down, but the engagements will. And so it's good to remember, actually, when you're downloading your CSV, make sure you download it at the absolute latest time of when you are reporting or sharing numbers with stakeholders, as Steph said. All right, let's move on. This is always an interesting one, sentiment. It could be its own webinar, couldn't it?
Yeah, and we've been there before. We've done a podcast on it, so I don't want to go over the things we covered in the podcast. Alongside Maya Kaleva, a wonderful agency called Cometric, we did a podcast. It was 2019 PR Week Measurement Conference. I remember it was probably like the last time I saw humans before lockdown, because I work from home and have done for 20 years in Lancashire, so probably November 2019 was the last time I was out and about in London. And so there is a podcast already on Resolution CoverageBook website. It's about sentiment analysis. It's probably more in the context of earned long form news. So we cover things like automated sentiment systems that you get with SaaS platforms versus humans. Of course, I'm in the business of selling humans to the industry, so I'm always going to beat the drum for the humans, but there are some great things that are being done in an automated way as well.
It was quite good on the podcast, actually, because I was interviewing Steph and Maya, and Maya works within a tech company that has a great AI, and Steph, you work obviously with human eyes checking everything, so it was a really good comparison, which I loved being in the middle of. But yeah, some really great topics around slang and like positives and negatives came up, so I do recommend. Again, we'll include the link in the follow-ups.
Even just things like, especially with long-form earned news articles, this is less of a problem with social, because generally social is shorter and so therefore has fewer paragraphs and complexities to it. What happens in an article or a social post when, say, multiple different competitors are mentioned, from whose point of view is the sentiment being assessed? And sometimes that's a really complex thing. Sometimes if you're working for a government department, for example, you're assessing the sentiment towards a topic, but actually that's quite a esoteric and intellectual thing to understand. So I wanted to just run through what I consider to be some of my five key principles of social media sentiment. I've revealed them all to you here, but I'm going to go through them all with some just visual accompaniment as well. So let me start with...
I know that a lot of CoverageBook customers are doing this themselves. Not everybody can afford the big sort of evaluation services afterwards. Do take note, guys, because I guess a lot of you will be downloading like the CSVs and going through your own coverage at the end of this year and doing some of this. So pretty great tips. Go ahead.
It's to just remind people that typically on social media, your social sentiment will be more polarized than, say, your earned media sentiment, and that's just a natural thing. You're likely to have either a greater proportion of positive or a greater proportion of negative, because it's the nature of social media for people to actually go and post when they feel emotional, and that emotion generally will come if they've got some either a happy response or a negative response to perhaps something that's going on in the world or something that they've read. So I've just got a few examples here from some work we've done in the healthcare sector and the tech sector, where we've compared basically the sentiment of their earned news coverage with the sentiment of their social coverage. And it's normal to see that greater level of polarization there on social media. I also encourage people to be gathering their earned social mentions from a SaaS platform, a social listening platform, and whether that SaaS platform has got an element of automated sentiment to challenge that sentiment and just dig into it. It's based on the principle, and forgive me if I'm allowed to use a minor swear word, but it's based on the principle of like shit in, shit out kind of thing. If the content that is there has not been challenged and retagged and corrected, if you haven't double checked all of the negatives to understand they really are negative, and you haven't double checked the positive, then all of the charts that come from it and all of the data and insights that come from it will be meaningless. So often, in an ideal world, you get a human to validate as much of the content as possible. But if budgets are limited, I urge people to definitely focus in and almost human validate the negatives and the positives particularly. And then my next kind of principle is that your Boolean search could actually be baking in a sentiment bias. And what I mean by that is that typically, in order to find earn social media mentions, particularly if you're working with a big brand that might get hundreds or thousands of mentions per day, even, you have to have some kind of Boolean search that will allow you to find relevant mentions for your brand. So, for example, the example I've got here is a UK bank called NatWest, for example. And so banks get an awful lot of mentions on social media from their customers daily. They get thousands and thousands of mentions. But then, of course, it might be annual results time, quarterly reporting time, and it's important for the corporate comms department within that bank to understand what the sentiment is around the reporting of those financial results. And typically what you might do in one of those big organisations is you might just limit your analysis of the financial results to just focus on perhaps a mention of the brand plus some keywords related to your financial results. It could be profit, or it could be increase or decrease, or Q3, Q4, all those kinds of words that are linked to regular quarterly reporting. And the trouble is with that is that sometimes, or a lot of the time, content that is being shared is often actually just headlines of news coverage. People sometimes literally just tweet the headline and the link to the news coverage that's being shared, but don't put any text around it to quantify that. And what we've got here on the screen is two of NatWest's two most shared articles in relation to its financial results. I think the financial results came out last week. The thing is that the headlines here do not have any keywords really in relation to financial results, but there could be negative. We can have I'm not going to have a discussion with myself here about whether it's positive or negative, but as you can see, some negative headlines or some positive headlines could be your most shared at a particular time, but the fact that you're automating your search to locate these social mentions might be baking in a sort of element of bias, because if you were relying solely on an area of automation to find these mentions for you, you would have missed the fact that this was the most shared headline in your social media. So I just encourage people just consider that if they work for a large brand in particular, and whether they are trying to locate just some specific activity related content and they're using Boolean search around that. Just the words that you can be using around that Boolean could be baking in sentiment bias or error. What we do with some organizations is literally we do have to have humans filtering through, because humans can understand the context of these headlines and realize that they are actually relevant to the financial results reporting. But that's a difficult thing to program into the computer at the beginning, because you don't know what the words are going to be in the news headlines.
So I guess with your team, Steph, I know that you work with some on a month-to-month basis. Obviously, this kind of level of evaluation normally would be needed at the end of the year, and you most of the time have a big batch of coverage. Would you recommend, and I guess what you might say, recommend doing this as you go along rather than waiting at the end? And how does it work with you and your team?
Yeah, sometimes the volume of content for a particular campaign or a particular client doesn't warrant the regular weekly. Some clients have daily, weekly, monthly reports, and it really depends on your organization, and it depends on your appetite within your organization to digest the content and actually act upon it, because there's no point producing reports if the team that are producing the reports are not really going to reflect on it and perhaps do anything differently as a result of it. So I think that's often determined by the appetite within the team to effect change based on the data that the reports show to them as well.
Yeah. I guess it depends what type of PR, if you're doing crisis and things like that as well.
Again, linking back, okay, fair enough. I am baking in my own bias towards humans in this webinar, so forgive me for plugging the humans, but there are sometimes drawbacks of the automated sentiment tools out there. It's called rules-based sentiments. The tools that provide automated sentiment have typically run off of effectively a range of dictionaries that sit in the back end, and those dictionaries have been tagged and classified with certain keywords marked as favourable or unfavourable. And you have to be really careful, for example, when you're working, say, in a healthcare setting, and perhaps you might have keywords related to cancer. I've got an example here on the screen, because some of the tools will see the word cancer and automatically mark it as negative. And of course, if you're this NHS trust here in the UK that's trying to convey messaging around some of its outreach there, and here it's a really great item. It links to it's obviously a great post because they put it out themselves, but it links to their site, it has calls to action and so on and so forth. That potentially could be marked as a negative piece by an automated tool. So you just need to be wary of some of the rules that affect sentiment, and some of the automated media SaaS tools that help you to locate your earned media mentions will allow you to almost train the artificial intelligence in effect, so you can correct it for your particular use case. So I do encourage people to be curious and to check as mentioned, check the negatives, check the positives. And if they're finding that words related to cancer are being marked as negative when perhaps they shouldn't have been, then they can probably press a few buttons within their tool in order to correct that for their specific use case. So you just do need to be careful of that. And then also to be mindful, of course, that most of these tools and sentiment is based upon what's being written in the text. And actually, an awful lot of communication is being done visually. Now, I've got here an example on the screen of two quite provocative political cartoons. Of course, most of us now communicate with photos, GIFs, memes, and so on. I'm particularly politically active at the moment, and I'm finding some political cartoons really quite thought-provoking. So we've got here an image on the screen in relation to this issue that's been going on of late in relation to the truckers' protest in Canada. And then, of course, we've got on the right-hand side, it looks to me an awful lot like Boris Johnson having passed out in a rose garden of number 10 Downing Street after drinking too much during first lockdown. So, of course, a lot of people are tweeting or sharing these kinds of political statements and literally not putting any text around it. There are some platforms out there that can do an image-based sentiment analysis, but you do need to understand what proportion, A, whether your tool is able to do that, and B, if you have got a high proportion of content that is being, where content is largely visual in nature rather than word-based in nature, do consider whether the sentiment tool is really doing the right job for your brand, and it might be necessary to consider the use of humans in tagging some of the sentiment there. Yeah, I just wanted to put that idea out there as well.
Building enough time.
And then just considering that actually, what else do we know about sentiment? Sentiment itself drives action. I did Latin and Italian at GCSE, and I think the word sentiment comes from the Italian word or Latin word sentir or sentire or something, which is like to feel. It's highly linked to emotions, isn't it? It's emotions then in themselves sort of then lead on to action. And I was particularly interested in a recent edition of the Joe Rogan Experience. It's a guy called Dr. Robert Epstein, and it was from a few weeks ago. And I found it really fascinating. And it also links into the Answer the Public tool, which is a great search listening tool provided by friends, linked to the CoverageBook team there at Answer the Public. And I encourage any of those that are interested, A, about sentiment, B, about how sentiment can impact behaviour, and then C, about search listening. If you're at all interested in that topic, I do encourage you to listen to this Dr. Robert Epstein episode on Joe Rogan, because it's fascinating and it builds on some of the insights I think we've all gained from reading that Everybody Lies book, which I always steal your anecdotes, Stella, whenever I'm on. I've watched so many of your webinars and I steal your anecdote about living your best life on social, but living your real life on
Google. Yes. Anyone doesn't know, isn't following, so Answer the Public is, I guess, like a monitoring tool for searches. So can be really, as Steph said, really useful if you're looking at how action is driven from PR. And then often people do, before they go and share their views on social, they'll go and search for something first of all. So the data that you're getting from those searches can be amazingly insightful. So go to answerthepublic.com and there's a whole webinar section, go to the YouTube, and yeah, it's a whole big other topic, which is very interesting to add to measurement. I'm just conscious that we've got 10 minutes left. So yeah, I'm going to hand back over to Steph. But I wanted to say to everybody, if you've got questions, post them now. Otherwise, we'll just keep taking our time to cover all of the slides. Okay.
And then just linking back to this sentiment driving action. So the point in this, with this Epstein episode, is that the sentiment of those first few suggestions that come back to you with Google autocomplete can really impact things like an election and so on and so forth. So it's just something to bear that in mind, but also to just think about actually sentiment of content, sentiment of news, sentiment of social media can actually lead to a lot of other actions too. It can affect share price. It can affect the bottom line. I used to be on the board at a local, let's call it a community college, a further education college here in the UK. And it was suffering from a poor reputation. And as a result of that, it was not getting enough students to come in. And as a result of that, it wasn't bringing enough revenue in, which was therefore not, the books weren't balanced. And so negative reputations can have a negative impact on the bottom line. So you do need to bear that in mind, because I think sentiment can be a really important thing, not just in helping you to assess outputs, but actually to have a consideration as to actually what the impact of this communication can be having on your organisation.
Okay, this might be an area which some of you have been waiting for, because it's always the golden question whenever we talk about measurement is, how do you calculate ROI? How do you get to a pound sign, a dollar sign in your reports? The short answer is that there is no silver bullet, obviously. So it really does depend on what your objectives are, when you're starting out your campaigns, as you all probably know. And also what kind of organization you're representing, what kind of calls to action there are, whether it has e-commerce attached to it. But I'm sure you're all aware of those. But what I wanted to do was just talk through a quick example of how somebody does it. So this might not be relevant for all, but this was relevant for James Alexander, of how he would get to a value from some of his earned coverage, which included social. So James Alexander his full title is Head of Culture and Entertainment, PR and Influence marketing for Diageo, which is a huge drinks brand. So James is a budget holder for Diageo, and if you're not aware of Diageo, absolutely huge global drinks brand. It has many brands within it, so Smirnoff, Guinness, Gordon's gin, could go on, absolutely loads. So he decides what budget goes to what kind of marketing activity at the end of each year for all of those different brands, and not just within the marketing activity, but then what agencies get as well. And then, so it's a hard decision, right? I don't know how many people we have in-house here, but I know a lot of agencies work with us, and I was always agency side, and we always want that budget. And it's fascinating actually to find out how that decision is made. What he does say is reach and followers mean absolutely nothing to him, and it actually annoys him when he gets that, because what he's doing is looking at earned, so whether that's earned social coverage or earned PR coverage. He also is reviewing digital work, so whether that's owned by the owned digital teams, digital agencies with owned social. Also, he works with advertising agencies, which is all digital advertising, and they are sending him metrics galore. So when he's getting a reach from some of his PR teams, he knew that he loved the PR campaigns, he could see the success, but that just doesn't help him in his calculations. So he was trying to find ways to literally, I think, Steph, you mentioned it, to apples, to have some kind of consistent way of comparing some of this activity. Now, don't get me wrong, he absolutely does have all of the other types of measurement in place. So when we talk through this, do not think for 1 second that he's not looking at key message delivery or the outcomes of opinions being changed and how much that better that is in PR in comparison to advertising. He absolutely has all of that as well, but he needed to get down to some nitty-gritty numbers of views, and especially this works for his type of brand. So you think about Smirnoff, it's such a huge target audience. Basically anybody above the age of 18 is their target audience. I used to work on Smirnoff, and even though we'd be like, hey, it's this kind of person, it's a big audience, and it's about building that brand on a global basis. It's talking about a big sort of target audience pool, and he needs to see how much of that brand has gone on. So you always look at, this is a very simplified way that he explained it, by the way. He had a much more detailed version, but essentially you'd have his paid activities, owned activity, and if you've ever worked on that, or if you are also collecting, we've already said, we know that we can get hold of impression metrics when you have access to your owned content on social, but also if you're doing paid amplification, you're going to get access to a lot more metrics too. So a key metric is always impressions of how many people have seen that. We've established now that earned does have estimated views within CoverageBook, and James was doing was using estimated views as a proxy of impressions. So he was able to get a good idea of views on those brand mentions across all activity. So that was good, even just for a comparison for that. But getting onto the value, you may be aware of a metric called cost per impressions, and so we're going to just go through that. So it's CPM, you would have seen, and it is a very common metric in advertising. It's a cost per 1,000 impressions, and he needed to get to that for earned as well. So essentially the way that that's worked out is how many times it costs to have your ad viewed on a particular page of the website, 1,000 times, and this was the way he calculated. I'm just conscious of the time. He used, this is your side, sorry, and he used that, but for estimated views. So it was a way that he was able to, going back, have a really good amount. So the way that he would do that as well was to have all of the costs for his social campaign. So often with paid for cost per impressions, it would be just the cost of an ad. He made sure that it was all costs. So the agency fees, the full production, absolutely all costs for all activity. So if this is something that you're interested in, it's a really good way of having an ROI figure if you are being realistic in using an estimated views. I will, in the follow-up emails, I will share the exact sort of way you can do it. And we've got a blog post on the resolution, which actually shows like the calculations of how you can do this. It is quite simple, but if you are pressured to have an ROI, it's a good one to have.
And you'll notice there that on Stella's slides there, it says CPM, cost per mille, but actually that means cost per thousand. If you go on to the next slide, I call it a CPT because I call it cost per thousand. But anyhow, it's the same difference. So here's just a sort of another simple bit of math, really. Forgive me on you doing it in pounds because I'm here in the UK, but let's just imagine you had a 25 grand PR budget for a campaign, and that campaign landed with 1 million people being reached, or all those impressions. So you literally divide one number by the other, times it by 1,000, and you get £2.50. Or you can switch it the other way around, and you can say that there were 40 people reached per pound spent, which is the same thing, just the other thing divided by the other thing. Sometimes by doing it number of people reached per pound spent is even more interesting if you're sitting at a table against the direct marketing guys who obviously can only reach a couple of people per pound spent because the cost of postage is extortionate these days. So again, it's another great way of being able to make your PR shine against the other parts of the marketing mix, because often those results are really good.
As I said at the beginning, this isn't instead of, but if you are pressured to have that ROI alongside all of your other evaluation metrics, it can be a useful one, and we will share more. There's more workings out. So yeah, do you want to sort of recap on some of your main points, Steph? Would be great.
Yeah. So just engagement rates, expressing them as a percentage rather than a number, it enables you to compare across different channels. So I encourage you to use those kind of metrics. Encourage you to focus on the post level performance rather than the page level, because I think that people interact with the post more than the page. Be conservative in your reach impressions. Use a tool such as CoverageBook to give you those estimated coverage views. Don't use huge follower numbers. If you're reporting on earned news, do not use monthly site-wide audience figures to be a proxy for your reach. You've got to be more credible in terms of reporting your reach. Bear in mind some of those considerations around social sentiment, and consider cost per 1,000 reached as a potential ROI metric, because once you know how many people you've potentially reached using your CoverageBook export, and you probably know how much money you've invested in it, it's just a simple calculation.
That's great. Good tips. As I mentioned, the recording and hopefully the deck as well will be included in the email. So expect that no later than Monday. I think we answered most of the questions as we were going through, which is pretty good because we have taken ourselves right up to the deadline, to the close. Let me just double check. Oh, somebody had asked about whether this came direct, but I'll just share anyway, whether when you add coverage, whether it's social or other, into CoverageBook, does it just live there forever? It does, unless you close your account. So yes, it is all safe. And as I mentioned, I think to Harry's question was about the metrics being updated. Yes, if you have a CoverageBook account, your coverage is safe in there, and metrics in terms of engagements will always be updated. I think that is it. I think we did answer everything. Steph, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. I always learn more, no matter how many times we talk, which we do talk and share stuff. So it's really helpful. Please do follow Steph. She's at Steph Bridgeman on Twitter, and she often does talks at different events, and mentioned AMEC. And as I said, I always learn more every time I hear her speak. So thank you, Steph, and thank you all for joining us and sticking around. That's it for now. Look out for the one next month, and we'll email you to let you know about it. Thank you.
Bye.
See you later, guys.